We move on to rule number 2, which is about connections. As Dr. Spear and Bowen wrote, rule number 2 is that every customer-supplier connection must be direct. And there must be an unambiguous yes or no way to send requests and receive responses. That paints a clear picture, but is an awful lot to remember. An easier way is clearly connect every customer and supplier. Let's begin to break down this rule. The first component is understanding the customer and supplier. Customer, somebody wants something. Supplier, somebody has something. Every single relationship you have in your organization is a customer-supplier relationship. It's important to understand which is which. It doesn't matter what they're supplying. It could be material, information, help, a raise, anything. But every single relationship is a customer and supplier. And it's important to understand who is who. I was observing an organization during an assessment and would sit in on their daily operations meeting. It was very clear as this meeting went on that nobody understood who the customer of this meeting really was. So I stopped the meeting and I asked. The operations group said, well, we're the customer because we need to let engineering know what our priorities are and where we need help. Engineering said, no, we're the customer because we need to let operations know what equipment we need access to and what technicians we need access to. You had a meeting with 2 customers and no suppliers. And so as a result, everybody was talking past each other, accomplishing nothing. I'm sure this has never happened to you, but this happens in a lot of organizations. Just a simple meeting that we have day after day. If we don't know who the customer is, it's very hard to finely tune to achieve the good outcome. So every single relationship has to be clearly defined. Who is the customer? What do they need? Who is the supplier? What are they supplying? As we think about who is the customer and who is the supplier, many people want to think about who gets to make the decision, but it's not that simple. You might be the customer and supplier in the same relationship. For example, if you go and visit the doctor, you might think, I'm clearly the customer. The doctor is a supplier of care. However, if you walk into the doctor and say, I don't feel well, that doctor is not going to be able to do their job. You are the supplier of information, and you are the customer of care. You are customers and suppliers to each other, but in very specific ways. The more you can break that down and be specific of how we are customers and suppliers of each other, it's much easier to design an effective process. Once we understand who is the customer and who is the supplier, now we need to form a connection. That means that we want to design a process that has an unambiguous way to connect them, meaning one way to make a request and one and only one way to respond. There is no ambiguity, there is no variation. Now this becomes important because every one of these handoffs of information, material, or help needs to be reliable. Someone is relying on that connection. A great example of this is the andon system in a Toyota factory. When a team member experiences an abnormality, it doesn't matter whether it's a problem they can solve, whether they think it's important or not, they pull the andon cord, and that turns on music and lights. That is their way of making a request to the supplier who is the team leader. That team leader has an equally unambiguous response. They show up immediately, not later, not if they have time, but immediately, and ask some version of, what's the problem and how can I help? They may not use those words every time, but the intent of the response is very clear. That team member is their customer, and they are there to provide help. There's one and only one way to make a request, and one and only one way to respond. Why is it so important to eliminate the ambiguity from our connections? Let's continue with that andon example. If I'm a team member, and I have a problem, I pull the cord. That's my way of making a request. But what if another team member says, I don't want to pull the cord, I want you to just wave me down. A different team leader says, don't wave me down, put your problem in writing. I work for another team leader, and they say, I don't want to hear about your problems. I now have many ways to make that request. Equally important is the ambiguity in the response. If one team leader comes and says, "What's the problem? How can I help?" and the next shows up and says, "What mistake did you make now?" I don't know what I'm going to get every time I request help. So both parts of this have to be unambiguous if I'm going to rely on that connection. When we have unambiguous connections, we can trust and rely on that connection to give us exactly what we need. Connections are a lot more difficult than activities because they're often invisible. They take many forms: signs, other physical features, hand gestures, emails. There's many different ways to form connections. But fundamentally, finding them involves answering the question, how do you know? How do you know when to start your work? How do you know when to stop something? How do you know when to change something? Every one of those involves a request. Every one of those involves a connection. As you're approaching an intersection, how do you know if you need to apply your brakes? Well, the red light on a signal or the red light on the tail of the car in front of you both gives you a very clear signal that you need to apply your brakes. How do I know when I'm done filling my car with fuel? The valve shuts off. How do I know that I've completed the task of putting on my seatbelt? The car beeps at me if it hasn't. Any of these are forms of connections that answer the question, how do I know? And if you're looking for your connections, whether you're finding ones that work or finding ones that are broken, they almost always involve answering the question, how do I know? An example of the importance of a clear connection involves surgery. And I love healthcare examples because of the inherent complexity that comes with healthcare. But let's say I have to do surgery on this patient's leg. Maybe they need a knee replacement or hip surgery. Well, which side do I do the surgery on? The old method was quite simple. I would take a marker and put an X on the leg. Now, when you go into surgery, you see the X on the leg. The only problem is this a clear signal? Does X mean cut here, or does X mean don't cut here? Worse yet, but your customer, the one person who can clarify that answer, is unconscious when you have to make that final decision. The most recent time I've observed such a surgery, they've changed to make it less unambiguous. That involves actually writing this leg or something equally clear on the person's leg and giving the pen to the patient and having them sign it to verify, yes, that is indeed what I want done. This becomes an unambiguous sign going into the surgery room. Now this might seem pretty simple. How hard is it to do surgery on the right leg? But under the old methods, it was shocking how often that's exactly what would happen. Do you have a clear, unambiguous signal to answer, how do I know which leg to perform surgery on? One of my favorite examples of a clear customer-supplier connection comes from Amazon. Amazon has a culture of customer obsession driven by its founder, Jeff Bezos. They've worked very hard on the connection between the customer and the call center. And Jeff Bezos himself will spend time in the call center taking customer complaints so that he clearly understands their needs. When he does this, he has an experienced operator sitting next with him to ensure that those calls can be handled with experience. During one of the calls, the first product that customer ordered pops up on the screen. And the experienced call center operator whispers in his ear that it's going to be returned for damage. Well, he's in shock that this can actually be known. But that's exactly why the customer was exchanging the product, because it was damaged. After the call, he asked the experienced operator, how did you know that was the problem? And her response was, that product is always returned for damage because they package it wrong. Now this was a shock to him because we have the information, we know what the problem is, and we haven't fixed it. Why? Because we don't have a clear connection. Call center operators would put problems into a database that would feed all the people who can fix those problems. But there's no clear connection with a response back to that call operator or back to the call center in general that ensures that those problems have been resolved. So Jeff came up with one of his many inventions. Just like the one-click buy now button, he created a one-click button for the call center operator that removes the Buy Now button from the product page. This does two things. First, it protects any more customers being harmed from a problem that they have within Amazon. And second, it puts the people who can fix problems on notice that they have to fix that problem because they can't sell a single other product until that problem is resolved. That is a clear customer-supplier connection. Designing connections within an array of complexities can be difficult, but a great example of this comes from the band Van Halen. In Van Halen's contracts when they were touring, they had a clause that said you could have no brown M&Ms in the dressing room with penalty of full cancellation of the contract. Now this sounded like just typical rock star prima donna, but there was actually a very deliberate process design behind it. When Van Halen was touring, they started to go to venues bringing more trucks and more equipment and more gear, more pyrotechnics than any other band before them. And they needed to know when they went on stage, the people weren't going to die, that we wouldn't have fires, that the stage wouldn't collapse. And as a result, they had a very complex contract with many, many pages, and that every clause mattered. Now, the complex way to deal with such a complex contract is when you show up at a venue, go through every single line item to verify. But instead, they put in this clause that said there will be no brown M&Ms in the dressing room of the artist with cancellation of the contract as the penalty. Why did they do this? Because they knew that if they saw M&Ms in the dressing room and no brown M&Ms, that concert provider had gone through that contract in detail and understood it and applied it. If they saw the brown M&Ms, they knew they had a problem because someone clearly didn't go through that with a fine-tooth comb. That became their response to tell them, how do I know my venue provider went through the contract accurately? So while it sounds like a typical rock star story, it's a great example of a clear connection in an otherwise complex task.